Have you ever sat in a status meeting where every team says they're on track, everything sounds fine, and you still have this feeling that something's off?
And then you map the actual work and discover that nothing is truly done? That's what we're going to talk about today.
6 teams, months of effort, everyone thought that they were over halfway, and they weren't even close. Welcome back to another episode of Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case.
Welcome to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
Every week, we take a real case study from professional service engagements and break it down. What was sold, what actually happened in delivery, and the root cause of where things started to go wrong.
And we're not just talking theory here. We show how most projects break down slowly across the agreement, the milestones, the work, and the way it's managed.
So we work the case step by step to understand where it really went wrong and how to fix it.
I'm Rhonda Lee.
And I'm Bryce Holloway.
And this is the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about an interesting case that happened in what we used to call the Immersive Learning Center at a company I worked for previously. It was named the Dojo, but it was our immersive learning area where we would bring in teams from across the organization and we would help them learn to be more agile. We would help them to learn agile methodologies and practices. We would help them to figure out how to organize their work, how to do it more effectively, how to work better as a team. And then we would also help to upskill their technology or their technical skills and abilities in the work that they were doing. So this was a large software program at an oil and gas company. And normally in the dojo, what we would do is we would bring one team in at a time. We had several different areas and coaches, so the whole center could actually bring in 4 teams at once. But usually we would bring one team in a lane and we would spend 6 weeks with that team.
And how would you identify what teams you would bring in?
No, that's a good question. So, and this actually is even a long story that we could go into maybe in its own episode, but the short version is when we first started it, we kind of looked around for teams that could use that help. But we actually made teams apply to come to the dojo. And the reason that we did that is because we wanted teams to take an active part in their transformation. And so they had to apply, and then we would interview the team leads for that team. And in many of the cases, we actually went and visited the team to observe them in their natural habitat, in their area where they worked, and see how they were working together, and talk to a couple of the team members and get a sense for, were they really ready for a change? Were they interested in learning and trying to do better and become more?
And I would assume that if they're applying, they're at least expressing some interest in wanting to change or improve. So they're not being forced there against their own will, right? That will help with adoption, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we were looking for. The interesting part of that is, though, that if you've worked in any large corporation, so if anybody's listening to this and they've worked in a large corporation, you understand, right? There's a lot of politics.
Yeah.
There's a lot of check boxes, right? If there's a new thing and it's deemed of value for teams, whether teams really are interested in receiving the value or not, they're usually interested in checking the box so they can tell other people they've done it, right?
Uh-huh.
And so there was a lot of that. And that's part of the reason we wanted people to not only apply, but we wanted to then come see the team and talk to the team and understand, why they wanted to come.
Mm-hmm.
When we first started the application process, I think even people that were higher management than I was kind of over the dojo, I think they assumed we were having people apply, but we would just accept everybody. So the first time we declined a team, I got a lot of pushback from my manager directly, but we told the team, we said, look, we know you've applied. A lot of teams would have their supervisors apply so they could check a box,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe the supervisor wasn't really wanting to see anything change, and the team didn't really understand, whether they needed to change or not. And so there was a number of those instances, but the first one that came to us, it was interesting. I was taking a chance, right, by saying, okay, I think we're going to decline this team. And we got a lot of pushback. We got pushback from the team, their supervisors. We got pushback from my own manager. What was interesting in that particular case, we declined the team and said, we think there's some things you should do on your own. And when you feel like you're ready for change and ready to improve, come back to us maybe after a number of months or maybe a year, whatever. And then interestingly enough, that first team that got declined came back and applied a year later, and we accepted them and brought them back in, and they did fantastic. Right. And
Wow.
so that was actually a positive for that. And then I never got pushed back again on declining other teams, which it didn't happen that often, but we wanted teams to come in and change. People don't change if they don't want to, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
matter how much you try to say, this is what you need to do to improve. If someone doesn't want to actually improve, or they don't want to make the changes that are recommended to improve, they just simply won't. And so the same thing is with learning, right? You can't force someone to learn something. And so we wanted people to be interested in that, be willing to make changes, be willing to at least try the things that we were coaching them to do. So that was kind of the general idea of this dojo experience. We would bring teams in, as I was mentioning, and we would bring them in for 6 weeks into our space. And part of the reason we did the into our space idea is it's easier to get people to listen to suggestions and recommendations on how they do things if they're not sitting in their own regular environment, right?
Yes.
Because if you do that to where they are normally, that feels like you're encroaching into what they're doing, right? But we invite them into our space and we say, here are some things that we recommend for what you guys are actually doing and how you're working. And it's taken a lot better that way. So this 6-week program was very interesting. We would start on day one, and I'll kind of go over some of those things here in a second. And we do a bunch of stuff with the team. It wasn't a day of working, but it was a day of full stuff. And then the rest of that first week, we would do 1-day sprints. So if you've ever worked in an agile environment before and understand what those are, that seems crazy to do a whole sprint in 1 day. And that included all of the agile ceremonies that go with it, right? So we did sprint planning in the morning. They worked for a few hours. We had a stand up right before lunch. They worked for a few more hours, and then we had a review and demo and retrospective at the end of the day. And we did that every single day. And the reason to do that, you wouldn't want to do that normally in your regular work environment. But we did that to instill the practices, right? Everything that you do, including at work, you will only get better at if you practice.
Yes.
That's not just reserved for musical instruments and whatever else. And so we wanted them to be able to practice. So we would do that for 1 week. And then the next 4 weeks, we would do 2-day sprints. And again, it's to get the repetition on how to do the ceremonies, how to plan better. There was so much planning going on, right? Because you would plan every single day. You would do your backlog grooming every 2 days. You would then plan every 2 days during those 4 weeks. You would do retrospectives every 2 days, and you had stand-ups like crazy. So it was a great opportunity to do that. And then after doing that for 4 weeks, the very last week in the dojo, we did a 1-week sprint. So it was kind of like a get back into the normal routine, right? A lot of teams that are agile teams might choose a 1 or 2 week sprint, depending on how their team operates and things like that. We found it very valuable to do a 1 or 2 week sprint, not longer if at all possible. And so that's kind of how the dojo worked. And the interesting thing here is I want to talk a little bit about how we brought the 6 teams in at once. Normally, like I said, we would go and we'd get an application for one team, and then we would go and talk to them, et cetera, and bring them in. And we had coaches that were one coach dedicated to the team in each, we call them lanes across our space. And then we had a floater coach that would float between 2 of them. And so you were getting a coach and a half, right? Or 2 coaches during, the big learning parts of your experience. But we had never brought in an entire program of teams before. And we had a former colleague of ours reach out and say, hey, I'm on this program. She was actually part of the group that oversaw the dojo and had been moved to another project or program. So she said, hey, I would find this very beneficial if we could bring in these teams. And we were like 1 at a time? No, she wanted to bring all 6. And so we were like, okay, how will we do this? We made them apply. We went and we interviewed several people on each of those teams. And at one point, our discussion focused around maybe they're not ready and we wouldn't bring them in. And so initially we said, we don't think that this is going to work to do this many teams at once. Not all of your teams seem like they're really on board, and we're not sure that their manager over the whole program is really on board. And so that was, at first we were just going to deny them. And then she set up a meeting with the manager over the group to talk about that. And so we had a good conversation, and it was kind of like, no, we think this is valuable. Long story short, we were convinced to bring them in. So we brought all 6 teams in to our 4-team capacity area. So we had to kind of move a lot of things around, and we brought in enough coaches to handle all 6 teams. And then we started doing all the things that we do with each of the teams. So day one has a lot of different activities for the team, but they're mostly designed so that we as coaches could learn about the team.
Mhm.
We want to know, what is the actual structure of your team?
Yeah.
Not roles, not titles. How does the team actually function? So we would give them some activities, some very basic, and then some more complex around like setting goals and all that. We always started out though with, now that you're here, we'll teach you some basic fundamentals of logistics in the dojo. This is how we vote on stuff as a team. It's always thumbs up or down or side, whatever. These are the votes that have to be unanimous, or these are the types of votes that could be, majority. And then we said, first activity is to pick a team name, right? And this is a fun activity for me because when you tell people get together, and then the only instruction we gave them is we said, here's a whiteboard, get together and discuss as a team and pick a name for your team. And sometimes that was a lot harder of an activity than people probably thought it would be, or than it honestly should have been. And that would all just depend on the team's dynamics, right? In the past, we had a team come in and we said, okay, pick a name. And immediately someone on the team jumps up, grabs the whiteboard marker, and we say, okay, that's one of the dominant people on the team.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Nobody else has said anything yet.
Yep.
And then they start to outline the process by which they're going to come up with the team name. And still most of the team has said nothing, right? We learn a ton. Now we're like, okay, these people do whatever is going on. They just roll with it. This guy might have a hard time with change because he wants to take charge of the stuff, right? And
Yes.
so sometimes even that simple activity would, would
Expose.
kind of, yeah, it
Expose.
definitely exposed team members,
Yeah.
but it also kind of stopped them in their tracks, right? And said, for some team members, it was like, we can't get past this idea that you're making us do this.
Yeah.
But that was one of my favorite activities. And part of the reason was just to watch the interactions of the team members. The other part of it was we would invite supervisors or managers of the team that was in the dojo to come and observe on day one, and then a few days during their 6-week stay. And inevitably, some manager or supervisor would lean over to me after 10 or so minutes and say, how long do you let this go? How long do you allow them to work on a team name?
Yeah.
And I would just say, you don't see all this stuff we're totally learning from this team right
Right.
now? Like, we're learning so much from this experience. This is invaluable.
And one of the things that I would notice is it's such a simple task. Find a team name. And yet these are people who are constantly dealing with more complex
Yes.
tasks, right? So it's interesting to see those who really struggle with it. And I would start to think, okay, they probably actually overthink things, which adds to inefficiencies and so forth. So I think that would be really interesting to watch, is who struggles with these more simple tasks, because generally they're going to be the ones that are going to overcomplicate other things.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that was interesting there too is you get to see a sense of how does the team currently work together?
Mhm.
And you're kind of forcing them into this paradigm of, you have to figure out how to work together.
Yeah.
If you can't figure out that basic foundational piece of your team, really most of the other things that you need to learn to do as a team aren't going to matter. So that was always really fun. And we'd go through a number of other activities throughout that day
Yeah.
to make sure the team understood not just who they were, right? And the team name wasn't really about who they were. It was about them coming together as a team and saying, this is what we're uniting around. But we would do other things around like who you are, what you actually accomplish, who you do that work for, who are you providing value to, and what is that value?
Who is your customer?
Who's your customer? Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we would talk about, what are your goals then? What are your goals as a team? What are you supposed to be accomplishing? And then what are your goals in the dojo specifically? So we'd kind of go through all that different stuff, and we would help them to figure out what's your schedule going to be like for all your ceremonies throughout your stay and all that kind of stuff. So it was really fun. So that's what we would do with the teams. And then we would just get running. So day 2 was like, you're still doing your work. That was the important part of the dojo too, is we didn't have other work for them to do.
Uh-huh.
We told them to come into our space. They would still work on all their work. The day 1 is the only one that we would take that away and say, you can't work on your work today. Every other day though, they're working on their work, and we would just simply help them to structure it, right? How
Uh-huh.
can we get you to understand how things go? And the dojo was not meant to be a day 1, here's all the stuff you should be doing, and then
Uh-huh.
let's help you do it. Because people don't learn that way.
Yeah.
People learn better when they stumble into the thing that isn't working. And then we say, oh, there's a solution for that actually. And so that's kind of how it was set up. That's how it was structured. So the rest of the first week, we would teach them for sure. We would teach them things like this is how you create a user story, right? Structuring your work. So we would create stories. We wouldn't introduce features and epics until later, because they'd say, well, we don't just do this little piece of thing. How do we focus on something bigger? We're like, oh, there's this concept of features and epics, right? So we would do that along the way. And we would introduce the basic topics. And then when they stumbled on, how do I know if that's done? We're like, oh, that's a great question. Here's acceptance criteria, right?
Mhm.
This is how you work on things together. This is how you take ownership of these different items, right? Because there wasn't any of that really. And for most of these teams. And so we would help them to kind of organize and structure that work along the way.
So I find it interesting because most of the corporate organizations that I've worked for, this type of training of how you structure and all of your work and all this other stuff usually was the responsibility of the team manager. So I find it interesting that these teams were coming to you guys. I mean, I guess it part of it is because it was such a very large organization that you were working for. But so I find it interesting that you were bringing in entire teams, including the team manager, to teach them and to train them how to structure their work. It actually kind of boggles my mind that the team manager themselves didn't know how to do this and didn't know how to teach their or show their team members how to do this.
Yeah, I think that that's more common than most people realize.
Okay.
And that's not just really large companies and corporations. That's also smaller groups too, right? Smaller companies
Okay.
and teams. Um, I think people tend to have this belief that we have structured our work the way it should be done.
Mhm.
Um, and they don't really understand until later, right? We've talked about this on a few other podcast episodes. Um, Sometimes if you're not structuring it correctly and you really don't know a better way,
Mhm.
then you'll find out at some point because it'll get you, right?
Yeah.
It's going to come
Oh,
back on you.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
So, one of the things we also would do is we had this kind of mantra in the dojo. We said, anyone who comes to the dojo gets coached. So as managers that were way above my pay grade came in
Mhm.
with their teams, they still got coached.
Wow.
And our coaches were trained and really kind of forced into this scenario so they would get over that fear quickly of being able to say to anybody, right? If a manager came in and threw their weight around and said, oh, but my team's
Mhm.
blah, 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 we would push back even in front of their own teams. And then if needed, we would pull them aside and say, hey, we need to dive deeper into this because this is actually a problem.
Yeah.
There's some great stories along those lines we'll cover in other podcast episodes
Okay.
for
I'm
sure.
excited.
Um, but yeah, we would say anyone who comes to the dojo. So we even would say if the CEO of the company comes to the dojo, we're going to coach him on, whatever happens to come up. That's just how this place works. And so it was really kind of freeing that way to be like, these are the things that we're going to help people with. Come see us and we can kind of help you
Mhm.
walk through it. Right. So the program was designed so that when we brought these teams in, we would kind of trickle the concepts we wanted them to learn along the way. Right. So it
Mhm.
wasn't all, like I said before, it wasn't all day 1. Here's all the things you should be doing. That didn't always go over well with everyone on the team. And in
Mhm.
this case, with the 6 teams, we'll talk about this in a second. The manager was a little upset by that as we got to the actual problem. So we first started out with, this is how the basic structure of work should be done. These are the things that you're missing from that now, right? This is how you plan. This is how you plan the next things. So being able
Mhm.
to prioritize the work that's in the backlog and make sure that it's in the right order with the most value, right? That kind of thing.
Mhm.
We would teach them how to size their work so they had an understanding of what was coming down the backlog, how big of a task those next things were and so forth, and how to plan each day. And so that was kind of the premise of the dojo. And so what that meant, though, for some teams is that if their problem wasn't in the individual pieces of work, but was in the understanding of everything that had to be done around that work, right? Because there's a lot of things. There's planning the work, there's doing the work, there's then, if I was a team member and doing a piece of work, my part might be done, right? But then that piece of work might have to go through a pipeline of stuff before it's really done, right? Whatever
Yes.
that looks like for the team or for the organization. And so each of these 6 teams, while they worked on a program together, they were under a program, they were working on their own siloed pieces and not really communicating to each other very well.
Yeah.
Okay. So we had this great activity that we would do with bigger teams or with bigger pieces of work they were doing, where certainly after the first week, sometimes not even into the second week, maybe into the third week, we would get together and say, okay, we've taught you about stories. We've taught you how to plan those day to day. We've taught you how to break those down into individual tasks. We've talked about what features are, because you have them, right? There's bigger pieces of this thing you're doing. But now we need to talk about those features as a whole. And when a feature is done, what has to be done to it or with it in order for it to be complete, right? And depending on the program or the project they were working on, that could be a lot of stuff or it could be a little bit of stuff. In this particular case, with these 6 teams, it was a lot of stuff. And so one of the reasons there was some interest in having those 6 teams come through is, like I mentioned, our previous colleague had said, look, I came into this group and there's a lot of discussion around, look how much we're getting done. Look, we're more than halfway there, across the entire program. And she said, I don't believe it. I'm not seeing that done. I'm trying to explain to these people that this isn't complete. There's so much more to be done and whatever else. And she would get pushback because the people who'd been there for a good while, right, have been telling a story. And when you try to challenge that story, that could sometimes become a problem. And so since she was now in that group, it was harder for her to challenge that. Well, when they came into the dojo, that's exactly what happened. Is we helped them to just see. We didn't just say, hey, you're doing it wrong. Here's your problems. We said, let's get together and let's map out all your features, everything that has to be done on this entire project, what you've got done so far, what the things you're currently working on, where are they in status, right? And things like that. So we built this large feature Kanban board, if you will, right? To show what are all the pieces that need to happen to each feature, to have it planned well, designed well, architected, then done, then, completed, and then all the different things, tested and all that. So we put up this, we went through and helped we got the team leads together, not just all the teams, right? Because they were busy doing things. We got the team leads together for that. We had the manager for the whole group in there. And so we got together and we said, okay, what are all the things that have to happen? Don't think about what has been done yet. Any given feature, what has to happen. And so we marked all that out. And we had this nice big whiteboard of Kanban board, right? And then we said, okay, great. Let's go around the room and talk of each of the teams. Which of your features are where on the board? And as people started to put them up and say, well, we're here, right? So people would say they'd move it across about halfway on the board. And I'd say, well, that's this piece. That's this status. Is that really done? Well, maybe that's not done. So they'd move it back one. We're like, well, is that thing actually done yet either? I think, aren't you here? And suddenly, after the first 2 went up, people were much more reluctant to be the next one to talk, right? Because what became extremely apparent very quickly is that none of the features were close to halfway done.
Yeah.
It was more like every feature on there that had been started, there were some that hadn't yet. So it wasn't like we started everything and haven't accomplished anything. It was close to that. But everything that had been started was more like 20-ish% complete.
Okay.
And had a lot more to go. And then, of course, there were the features that hadn't been started. And so we put all those up there. And I was the facilitator for this activity with the teams. And I have to be honest, as I'm putting up the last ones on the board, and they were all sitting around, we're in a big conference room.
Yeah.
As I was putting up the last things on the board, I was so nervous to turn around because I was just like, okay, this is where you guys just said this is. I didn't say this is where this is.
Yeah.
And it was, it took a minute. Everyone in the room was just like, oh.
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to say anything because what were they going to say? Oh, you're
Yeah.
wrong. I was like, I just asked you questions and we put the things on the board, right? We're here to help you to see where you are. You can only get better. You can only know what the path is to progress if you know where you really are. And that's what we had to try to help these teams to
And
do.
I want to interject here. So, because I deal with this all the time too, because what you just went through and described this extensive process that you just did to identify this stuff. And most people will hear that and think, "Oh my gosh, that sounds so exhausting. You're wasting so much time. It takes so much time." And it took you you spent about what, a day, you said, mapping this out, right?
Yeah. So this was only a couple of hours. This meeting
Okay,
only
so you
went
spent a
maybe a
couple of
couple of
hours.
hours. Yeah.
Okay, so you spent a couple of hours kind of mapping this out to see exactly where everybody was. But yet, how long had they spent on this 20%
Months.
that, yeah, they had spent months to do this 20% that they thought was near completion, right? So that's something that I'm always telling people when I work with them is because they want, oh no, we don't want to waste our time doing that. You know, we just want to, we just want to press forward. We don't need to do all this planning up front. And there is some, you know, you don't have to necessarily plan everything, but taking a couple of hours to sit down and map this out and understand exactly where everybody was probably saved. And I say probably, we know for a fact that had they continued, they would have just wasted more months on this 20% and maybe gotten maybe another 10% done.
Quite likely. I mean, the project would have gone on for a lot longer than it should have. That's true. The thing that's interesting about this, and I love these types of activities because it really does highlight, oh my gosh, it shows people things they didn't know before, right? Collectively, as a group of 6 teams, no individual team lead or tech lead or whatever, because we had several of those on each team, none of them really truly understood what the state of the entire program was. They thought they understood the state of their own piece, which they still didn't entirely. But because of that, that also surfaced some other issues, which you can get into in a second, which was because they didn't understand where they actually were and the distance between that and where they're supposed to get, they weren't prioritizing things correctly, right? So each team, and we highlighted this on previous episodes, each team had fallen into that trap of we're doing the best thing we think we're supposed to do without understanding that given the priority of the whole program, it probably would have been better if they switched to this thing or did this other thing first that would facilitate this for team 3 or whatever to get all those things working better, right?
Yes.
And so they hadn't come together as a program and done this and outlined the things that were underway and where they really were to understand their current progress. So it highlighted a priority issue, that's for sure. Maybe a bigger issue, maybe just the same size big issue, was that they highlighted that they weren't reporting correct progress. So they were having meetings, sure, with the manager in the room, and the manager understood, right? He's only listening to the reports of his people.
Yes.
He understands that the project is, 60 to 70% done.
Yes.
He's like, this is great, right? And he is going to then make some assertions to people outside of his group, maybe his management, about what that means, right? He's taking that information and he's saying, we predict we can get this done by X time. Maybe it's even before the original agreed upon deadline, but he didn't have the information.
Yes.
So the reaction in the room was pretty interesting. I turned around, I said, okay, what do you guys think? Everybody took a big sigh. There was a deep breath. And then the manager was like, I can't believe, he was not shouting, but he was like louder, right? I can't believe this. And then he looked at me and the other coach that was in the room and he said, why didn't you highlight this for us earlier? And I said, no, this is the earliest we could have done that, right? Because you guys needed to understand the need for all these other pieces, how to actually structure your work for you to understand then, given that structure, this is what it looks like, right? And so I think he was just really frustrated. Obviously, he wasn't mad at us, like we didn't do anything, right? But he was frustrated because he had been told a thing, right? And it's not that people were trying to be dishonest and lie to him, but they didn't have the information either. And so they were trying to convey what they understood. He was taking that at face value, which I think is something most managers do.
Yep. They want to assume
whether they should or not, right? And so he was taking that at face value, and then it just wasn't the case, right? So we highlighted that for them. I love these types of activities. I love doing things like value stream mapping helps you
Yes.
with a similar thing, right? To say, what is the thing you guys produce? Let's follow that through the path of its life cycle. Hey, have you discovered these 10 things you could do more efficiently, or maybe even cut
Yes.
out and make it better, right? And so this is one of those activities that really is a big aha moment for teams. And I just loved being a part of that. But that's what this one in particular showed for this group of 6 teams.
Okay, I want to interject something, and I'm super excited because as you're saying these things and the manager is saying, "Oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I'm thinking this is why they needed a casework, because if they had been able to put all of this in the casework, the AI agent would have caught all of this. The AI agent would have said, "Hey, this is where you're stalling. This is what it's costing you. This is how much time it's costing you, whatever. And this is what your next priority needs to be."
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? Having an opportunity, having a way to structure that kind of work
Uh-huh.
is particularly good. And in this particular case, and to make the analogy with the casework, they hadn't structured their work properly, right?
Yes,
So
correct.
in an agile software team, that looks like stories and features and epics, right?
Mhm.
And it looks like breaking those stories down into tasks. In the casework, where it's the same idea, but with teams that aren't software necessarily, I'd probably run a regular software project doing that as an agile team, but maybe the overall project, I would do something like the casework to keep track of what are those milestones, right?
Yep.
So think similar to features and epics. What are the milestones we need to accomplish? Then what are the tasks that need to get done, and who's going to take ownership of those tasks to get them done? And then we're going to have the proper reporting and keep track of how much time you're actually spending on
Yes.
that and so forth. And you're right, that was a miss in this particular group. And so it did highlight the basic need that
Yes.
the dojo fulfilled, which is, how to structure your work, how to get that work then done effectively and efficiently. But it
Mhm.
also highlighted several other issues too, like there wasn't great communication of progress.
I think the reason why there was a lack of communication as to the actual progress was because people misunderstood the progress because it wasn't actually being accurately tracked.
Correct.
And so it was miscommunication, but they communicated according to their understanding. So it was more of a misunderstanding of
Yes.
what their actual progress was, right?
No, exactly. And that's going to come, best of intentions across the board. That's going to
Yeah.
come if your work isn't structured correctly or at all, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have a way to keep track of all the work that needs to be done, and we understand, right? New work comes up, new requirements, that kind of thing. We talked a little bit about that in previous episodes, making sure we get those changes documented and highlighted, right? But if you're not able to keep track of all those items, what happens next, what has to happen first, when are all these things going to be done? Then yeah, your ability to communicate progress is going to be limited or not really be there, even though you're communicating something.
It's going to be
So
inaccurate.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that was definitely one of the bigger problems. The other really big problem that was highlighted is that there was no understanding of what it meant for something to be done, right?
Yes.
It
Hmm.
it was there on the team level. So if so and so over here was writing this new piece of the software, they might understand what that meant to be done. And we helped them early on in their stay to understand what that really was, right? There needs to be acceptance criteria. How do you know if it's completed or not? Well, your product manager and the team need to come together and say, this is explicitly what it means when this story is done, right? We did those basic things. So
Hmm.
they had those understandings, but they didn't really understand what it meant at the larger level, right? When this feature is complete, is it really complete? I mean, the code has been written. Is that complete? Hasn't been tested yet. So maybe it's not complete yet.
Yep.
But even after it's tested, is that now complete? Has there been, has it gone through all these different checks? And has it gone through, there's usually logistical things with a large team like this. Has it been deployed? Are there automated tests set up? Right? There's a lot of things that go into something like this being done, and they
Mhm.
didn't have that definition at all, right?
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that we did cover in the dojo. Is one of the things we covered even before this meeting, so they would understand. Oh, you remember that thing we talked about, a few days ago, or whatever? You didn't have that. Because you didn't have that, it led to this, and that's what we're seeing here now.
Yeah.
And so we would help them kind of stumble over oh my gosh, this is why we need these things you're teaching us, right?
Yes.
And so that was it highlighted out as a huge problem. There was no definition of done originally, even for the smaller stuff, but certainly not for any of the larger pieces that really went into the whole discussion of progress.
I would say it's very common, at least with organizations that I've worked with. Very rarely do they define what done looks like, what success looks like, right? And a lot of people stumble over that. I think we talked about a couple episodes ago where somebody just came in and said, well, we need client portals, thinking almost with this idea that there's just this like standard idea of what a client portal is, even though there was a complex business model behind this that would influence it. So the whole concept of what does success look like? What does done look like? I think that's one of the key components to a successful project.
Yes, absolutely. And part of that done discussion, we talked about it with the episode you were just mentioning, right? Where it was like, create this portal, do this other thing. Where are we going to get the data from? I don't know. It's going to magically appear, right? There
Yeah.
was no integration
No.
discussion in that instance. The
Uh-huh.
same thing was true in this particular case. So each of these 6 teams, as you imagine, are working on the same larger program,
Mhm.
but they're each doing their individual pieces. And so that also came out, right, in our discussion of what is completed, because team A is doing a thing team C needs, right?
Yes.
And so they're working on other things that don't need that thing yet, but there comes a stopping point where they can't move forward, right?
Yeah.
And
And
to be honest, if they were all 60% done, they would have hit that stopping point a long time earlier,
yeah.
because they had not had those kinds of discussions. There were loose discussions held. Yeah, we think we're going to give you this and it's going to look this way and whatever. But they hadn't really gotten together and said, okay, we're going to be waiting on you for this. So we need to know when that's going to be done, and we can hold off for X amount of time. Do you need help? Maybe having a team jump in to help them get to that point too. That was never a discussion that they really entertained. So there wasn't this idea of integrations either, which does play a huge role in the done discussion, especially when you're talking about features or epics of a larger program. And so that was one of the columns, right, that they never even got close to
Yeah.
on the Kanban board.
Well, and you even mentioned earlier that they were all, siloed working in their projects, right? But now you're talking about, well, team A was working on something that team C was going to eventually need. And that's something else that I see all the time. And I don't know what drives this, but I mean, I know people have a lot of pride in what it is that they're doing. And so sometimes they're like, oh, I don't want to involve this other team. I don't understand what drives that. But yeah, it's like you need to be talking across the teams, especially if you're working on something that they need.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And if you haven't mapped out those bigger pieces,
And
if
where
you
they
haven't
go.
mapped out the
Yeah.
milestones, right? You might have milestones on a program like this that are like, do this piece of work for team A, B, C, D, and E. And the next milestone, or maybe in the middle there, is combine team A's and team B's thing.
Mhm.
Right. But if you don't have those milestones mapped out at all, you're going to forget them.
Yes.
Right. The bigger the project, the bigger the program you're working on, the more things can be forgotten
Yes.
if
Oh
they're
my
not
gosh.
documented in detail and designed and architected the right way, right?
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
I say that having them documented and architected in the right way and so forth, because oftentimes there is a lot of documentation on a program like
Mhm.
this, but it's not always good documentation, right? I worked on another very, very large project, which we could talk about in multiple episodes, and maybe we'll later. And there was so much stuff on that project documented that nobody ever saw.
Yes.
Nobody on the team. I mean, there were decisions made that maybe 2 or 3 people understood, but the team didn't understand them. And so they're useless. Right.
Yeah.
And I always loved, one of the things that I say loved facetiously, because I didn't love it at this particular company, is every project that was done had a huge list of lessons learned for this project. Right.
Yes.
So every other project that was going to start that was similar to that one could look through these lessons learned, but they were stored in a place where nobody ever saw them. Nobody
Mhm.
went and looked. There was no actual search capability to find these different things. These were things that were lost. And quite honestly, half the lessons learned were bogus anyway.
Mhm.
So when we talk about having documented processes, documented milestones, the actual things we need to know to get to the end, they need to be documented correctly, need to be good design, good architecture to understand these are all the things that we have to hit. And so again, in this particular case with these 6 teams, there was a few of those things lacking, and that's how they got to where they were. There is a positive side to this case. I know several of the cases we've talked about seem to have a very negative spin, right? Oh my gosh, all these things went wrong. And then we're just explaining why they all went wrong. In this
Yeah.
particular case, the good thing was that we had discovered, like we helped the teams learn how to organize their work and to structure it properly.
Mhm.
We had discovered this big issue that they didn't really understand what done meant for any of their larger pieces for sure. And we helped them to refine that for the smaller pieces. There had not been discussions, true, valuable discussions yet on integrating these pieces. And so we spent the rest of the time targeting these bigger issues.
Yeah.
And so this was one of our huge success stories actually out of the dojo. These 6 teams made great progress, huge progress. When they left the dojo, they were working better as teams than they had before. The teams were working as a team of teams, which they hadn't really been doing. That was going really well. There were some effective changes made to some of the team structure, which was really good. And they made huge progress going forward. I actually don't know what the end result was for that particular program. We, kept in contact a little bit with them, but moved on to other teams to help them as well. But they made huge strides, and they were getting way more work done than they had before they got into the dojo. We kind of prided ourselves on that being the result for most of the teams. We
Mhm.
could probably get into, there were a couple teams that didn't happen that way, but there
Yeah.
were 30 plus that did, right? And this was one of those great success stories. So we discovered these things earlier on, in their stay with us, and we helped them work through most of those and gave them tools that they could use as they went forward. So it was actually a really huge success story, but it was definitely an opportunity to highlight these are the things that they had missed. These are common patterns that teams will miss. And so these are things that we think is valuable to highlight, let people know these are the things you can avoid. And this
Mhm.
is how, right?
Well, and you mentioned earlier, especially the larger the project, the easier it is for the tiny details to fall through the cracks and to get lost and to get forgotten. And so mapping everything out from beginning to end is what helps keep those things from falling through the cracks
Yeah. Yep.
and from getting forgotten.
And when you have good structure, you have better things to talk about in your stand-up meetings,
Yes.
right? In
And
my
you have
career,
proof or
yes,
evidence of your progress instead of
right.
just, you communicating where you think you are, right?
Yep. In my career, and I've been guilty of it myself. I'll just preface it with that. I've been in so many stand-up meetings
Mhm.
where most of the things reported around the room went something like, yeah, we're moving forward, making good progress. And then they move on to the next person. That
Yep.
tells you nothing at all, right?
No, yeah. Okay,
You need
what
to
kind of progress
understand,
are you doing?
yeah, what has moved forward, how forward did it move, and
Yeah,
and like what's left and all these types of things, right?
yeah.
And who can help you get there if you're not getting there fast enough. I think some of the biggest problems with our communication of progress is being
Mhm.
afraid,
Yes.
because it feels like when you set up a project, and especially if there's a deadline, even if it's just a rough deadline, which is really
Yes.
chiseled and sewn for the manager, that people are afraid to highlight things that are real on the project.
Mhm.
Hey, we
Yeah.
thought this was going to take X amount of time. This piece has been a lot harder for these reasons, XYZ. And and so this is kind of where we are, right?
Yeah.
And if things don't change, if we can't improve or make a difference in that progress, then we're not going to hit that deadline. People should be able to say that because that helps your project.
Yes. Yes.
But most people don't feel that safety to do that, right? Whether that's personal, they
Yeah.
just don't, they're just afraid, or whether it's actually like led by management to kind of make
Yeah.
them afraid.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't feel free to do that, and so that communication gets lost, right?
Yeah.
And kind of the oh yeah, things are going well.
Yeah. Well, and if you have the evidence, you also have the evidence as to why it's now behind or why it took longer than anticipated. And it's evidence that it's not necessarily somebody's fault, because I think that's really what the hesitation is. People hesitate because they feel like they're going to be blamed, they're going to be at fault. But if you have this, evidence of something that is entirely outside your control, then it is what it is and it can't be your fault. And if it is, then that's a management issue at that.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because bringing up the topic of blame, right?
Yeah.
That is just a cancer in most organizations,
Yes.
because again, it is easy to pick out the employee or contractor or whatever who goes out of their way to make everything bad, right?
Yes. Yes.
If you have someone who's just purposely doing things bad, you need to get rid of the people. That's true.
Mhm. Yes.
Most people are not that way.
Yes.
So
Correct.
even when people make mistakes, if there's a culture of blame, you are just killing your
Yeah.
ability to understand what's actually happening, have people tell you the truth,
Mhm.
right? because they're going to be afraid, right?
Yep.
Even if they didn't do it,
Yep.
right? Even if the progress is behind and it's not their fault or anyone on the team's fault, if you have a culture of blame, that's not going to surface. And so that's a huge problem, right? And to be honest, if you've been working in the tech world in development or over any systems anywhere, and you haven't had that moment where you brought an entire system down,
Yeah. A moment of
unfortunately,
failure. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
then I'd be shocked, right?
Right.
Everybody's done something like that, or they're
Right.
just too early in their career. And that's
Right.
okay. The world hasn't exploded, right? We can recover from those things in most cases.
Yeah.
And so it shouldn't be a matter of blame game. It should be like, okay,
How do we
how did
fix
that
it?
happen? Something didn't get caught. It wasn't
Yeah.
just you, right? It's never just the individual. There was maybe a
Yeah.
guardrail missing, or there was something else that happened. And so this thing came down or
Yeah.
whatever. You can't blame the individual. You say, great, what do we learn from this
Mhm.
as individuals, as a team, as a company,
Yeah.
and move forward, right?
I was gonna say, and I worked for an organization at one point where they were so hesitant to blame somebody that they were very reluctant to go see what caused the problem, which was also very damaging because, okay, how do we make sure it doesn't happen again if we don't
Yes.
identify how or why it happened to begin with, right?
Yep.
And so I would have to be like, okay, I'm not looking for blame. I'm looking for, was this something that could have been prevented for the sake of preventing it in the future? Do you know
Right.
what I'm saying?
Yep. And that's
Yeah.
exactly, that goes to exactly what we were talking about with this group of 6 teams, and they're outlining their features on a Kanban board scenario, right? Is that because I think most people, did have this like nervousness about being blamed about whatever. There was definitely that palpable feeling in the room when it was like, oh, all of your teams are actually way further behind than you've been saying.
Yeah.
You didn't realize it. There were things you were missing, right? You didn't
Mhm.
purposely lie to your manager. But the manager had this frustration, I think wanted to blame some people
Yeah.
immediately. And we were
Probably.
like, look, you guys didn't know this wasn't structured this way. Now it is. Now you can be better this way. You can
Yes.
talk more intelligently about progress and things like that. Yeah, you just have to get rid of blame from your culture because it accomplishes nothing, right?
Yep.
It just puts people on edge. You don't learn from it. Like you just said, people are afraid to go back and look at what actually happened for fear that they might be part of the specific
Yep.
blame target. And you don't learn that way, right? And so if you want to get better, if you want to be able to structure all your work and see what's happening, everybody has to be okay with when mistakes are made or it isn't going quite the way you thought it would, and just come up with solutions to get there. Right.
I think when people are reporting on progress, right? And we talked about how they would report that like 60% or more of the project was complete, when in reality, 20% was. And we already identified this is what happens when progress is not defined. And it's because people default to simply activity, right? Well, we've been
Yep.
actively working on it for 6 weeks and we said that it would take 8 weeks. And so clearly that must mean that we're 60% done or whatever, because that's usually the only thing that they have to point to because it hasn't been defined and there is no structure.
Right. And I think this, we've highlighted before, people inherently want to do good work, right?
Mhm.
And so when the true progress isn't defined or understood, I think it's like you say, people are doing work. They're
Yeah.
staying busy for the most part, right? And so they'll start to report on that activity, like you said, rather than the actual progress and where they've really gotten to. Yeah. So that's a really big problem.
And it's probably why they feel like everything's fine right up until they don't, right? Because there's no early like built-in signal into the system to say, hey, you're off track, you're out of scope, or this is dragging on longer than it should, or you're spinning your wheels or whatever. This should be your next priority. There's nothing built into the system for that.
Right. So I think that the biggest takeaways, and we can kind of move to talking about what do we learn from this case, right?
Okay.
They learned a great deal and they moved on and did great things.
Yes.
As far as I'm aware, that project was successful. But what did they learn? What can we learn? I think in our own work, one of the biggest things is how to structure your work properly, right?
Yes.
If you have your work structured correctly, if you have a mechanism for capturing additional requirements or needs and make sure they're worked into the plan properly, you're going to have a much higher chance of being able to understand your progress. And it's understanding the progress with evidence, right? So,
Mhm.
for example, if you have a milestone and you say, Is this milestone complete? Right? No, it's got X amount of tasks still to do. You can start to see this is how we get a good understanding of the progress. So having those mapped out is extremely important. I think understanding what does done really look like, right? What is the criteria for the work to be done? So acceptance criteria on your individual tasks, understanding what it means when your bigger thing is done. If it's a milestone, how do I know this is complete? Well, it's going to produce this kind of outcome and this kind of outcome and this kind of outcome. If we don't have those, then that's not done, right?
Yes.
And it should also include, right, your milestones. Maybe each milestone includes things like we've tested this, we have reviewed this with whatever group or partners whatever it is, right? You could have those as part of your milestones, or you could have additional milestones, right? So you say, we finished this piece. The next milestone is do the other things that now come with that finished piece, right? So if you're integrating stuff, that's a milestone. Let's get these two things together, or 3 or 4 things, or whatever it is. So having those is really important.
And sequencing them too in the delivery, right? So the teams are aligned, like if team A or if team C needs something from team A, then team C needs to be working on something else while team A is working on that, working that all in, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where communication between those teams is vital, right?
Yeah.
You can't really work completely in a silo when you're on a larger project with multiple teams. You should be doing the heads down work. That's true on the things that you're in charge of, but somebody has to be there to say, we're communicating with the team. And sometimes that means you have to resequence the milestones along the way. That's okay.
Yes.
But if you're keeping track of that real time, you have a place to do that, right? That everyone can see and understand. Then you're keeping track of that correctly, and you can communicate that progress in reality instead of making stuff up.
And that way, leadership is no longer relying on interpretation. They're actually relying on evidence, right?
Exactly. And that's the bigger piece, right? Moving forward and making good progress doesn't tell you anything in a stand-up meeting. There's no evidence for that, right?
Yeah.
So that's a useless thing. And again, I was guilty of that in the past. I'm sure if there's any of my friends listening to this, they'll be laughing their heads off right now. But that doesn't tell you anything, right?
Yeah.
You need to be able to say, this is what we have been working on. This is the things of that are done so far. And these are the things that we're either starting or the middle of. And we're having a problem with this. We need help with this. Is there anyone that can help with that? Right?
Yeah.
These are the types of communication pieces that have to happen to really understand your progress along the way. It has to be based on real items. It has to be based on evidence of work done. It's good to keep track of how much people are working. That's true.
Yes.
Because what that tells you, right? If you have a team and they're extremely busy, right? But the evidence of the work being done is that not a lot of work has been done.
Yep.
That prompts another question. It doesn't prompt blame.
Yes.
But it prompts a question to say, okay, why is it like, are you doing all of that work on this? Right? The next question will be, how are you doing the work on this? And then can we do that better? Do you need other people to help? It doesn't always work to add people to a project. I always loved help. We're like, throw 5 more people at it. That's not how that works. I love the analogy from the Agile world of 9 women can't make a baby in a month, right? It doesn't always help to add people to a situation on a task, but sometimes it does. And so being able to ask those questions and say, we've been keeping track of all time worked, which I think is extremely important, especially if you're a consulting firm who's charging by the hour and things like that. You have to keep track of that. If you're keeping track of all that stuff, and so this is how much you've done activity-wise, but this is how much has been accomplished when it should have been, or the initial plan might have looked like this. The question needs to be, what's different, right? Why is it only this far? And so it does help with those kind of conversations. Were we just too optimistic in our estimates or something, which happens? Or, is there a more effective way to do X, Y, Z, right? So it's important to have these indicators and the pieces of data to help you with the conversations so your teams can understand where they really are, what it really will take to get further. But yeah, it should be your actual progress should be based on evidence. And, it should be based on evidence of what is working and deliverable, right? So if everything you're working on is 70% done, you're not 70% done. You're nowhere, right? That was this case, right? This case was like, oh yeah, we're all 60%.
Yep.
They really weren't. But even if they were 60% done on any of the items, but nothing was complete, nothing's deliverable. Your progress is next to nothing, right?
Yep.
So I think it's important for groups to be able to have the data to organize their work, structure properly, be able to keep track of the metrics and the things that help them to ask the questions and be able to tell the true story. And I think that's what this case really highlighted.
Absolutely. So let's talk about how somebody could use the casework to structure the work for a similar project.
Yeah, so that's really a good question, right? The casework is designed to help companies or teams to structure their work and see all the things we just talked about, right?
Mhm.
And so it's not built to only work for certain types of teams or certain types of work. It's not specifically for, software development teams
Mhm.
and just to help them with, another agile tool,
Yeah.
but it's actually designed to help a broad range of companies and teams keep track of their work when there aren't tools for that, right? So if
Yes.
you're a software development shop, there is, I wouldn't say a plethora, but there's a good number of tools you can use to kind of gather all that work together. It doesn't keep track of all the things that the casework does. For example, your time spent and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't, right? Agile tools
And it
usually help
doesn't,
with just getting the work completed.
yeah. And it doesn't have the AI agent that we have on the casework either.
Correct. That's correct. Many of these tools probably will in the next few years,
Yeah.
but the casework was designed to be more broad, right? So it helps you as a consulting firm or an advisory firm or kind of any firm that does professional services to make sure that the work you have agreed to do, you've got the sale already, you've got an agreement that everyone can see and share an understanding of, and then it helps you structure the work to accomplish that thing you've agreed to, all the way from milestones. So, in this particular project, it was epics and features, right? That's milestones.
Yep.
Keeps track of tasks on those milestones to help you get the deliverables you agreed to in your engagement document, whatever that looks like.
Yes.
And then there's lots of things that I think tools like this don't normally also include because they, a lot of people think, oh, I have a tool for this. For example, just notes.
Yeah.
It's so vital to keep important notes about what is happening, about interactions you've had with other people, right? Third parties, maybe for this project, with the client, right? So you're keeping track of everything that has been said or done, interactions you've had and everything. So notes are super important. They're a super simple feature, but they're vitally important to a
Yes.
case.
Well,
Documents, of course, there's lots of opportunities to keep track of documents in different systems, but having them together with a specific case in context is really important.
and we are also able to identify or flag potential scope creep in real time with a change request workflow so that you can recapture that additional work as additional revenue rather than spending a bunch of time doing extra work that you're actually giving away for free.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. So think about this project. If this project was maybe not software development, but some other project in a consulting firm, and you have all these teams working like mad on their work, and you discover that you're 20% done. Well,
Mhm.
immediately as a partner of a firm like that, I would immediately say, let me see how much we've spent
Yes.
and how much we're actually going to receive, right?
Mhm.
Especially if you're in any kind of fixed fee environment, that can
Yes.
be detrimental to not
Yes.
understand your real progress. So that would be my question is, okay, wait a minute. We've been thinking we're X amount done, 67% done. We're really 20% done.
Mhm.
That for us means our margin is just
Yeah.
shrinking, right?
Shrinking.
If it's not already gone.
Yeah, and I would think that a lot of people probably think, "Oh, well, I don't do hourly, so I don't need to track my hours." And so, but actually you do. You need to track your hours. More importantly, if you're fixed fee, because it doesn't take very long before you run out of margin.
Exactly. It's the same idea. It's the same concept of keeping track of your spending in your own personal bank account.
Yes. Oh,
If you
absolutely.
do
Yes.
not keep track of that, you will get to the end of the month and go, what happened to all my money? Right.
I have no
So
money and I'm in the
this
hole.
exactly. So the same thing is true. If you're a fixed fee shop, which is great, and you don't keep track of the time you spend working on each individual project or case, you are likely throwing money away. Right.
Yes.
And so you really need to keep track of that stuff. And so the casework is really good for that too. Right. So if you're hourly billed or if you're a fixed fee case, or if you're doing both, right, the
Mhm.
casework will help you keep track of that. And if you're a billed hourly shop, for example, you can keep track of billable and non-billable time, right? And that's also important too, because you need to understand the non-billables, which you shouldn't have a ton of, hopefully, right?
Yes.
Depending on your work, maybe you will, but you still want to know what that division is, right?
Mhm.
How much can we actually charge to the client versus the stuff that we can't? And that affects your margin in the end too.
And not only that, but when the client is hit with this big bill at the end of the project, you are now able to justify, look, here are the hours. Here are the hours spent on this is exactly what we did. And
Right.
then you're not having to, issue these big discounts just to keep the customer happy.
Right. It also helps you have those conversations early.
Yes.
So you can
yes.
go to the client and they say, well, how much are you done? And we've kind of spent a lot of money. You can say, well, here's all the stuff that we have done. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can pass it to the client and say, look, you have the opportunity to say, that's enough, right? Or we don't need to go further, or we're not willing to pay the next thing. That's okay, right? But at least they have that information and you can have those conversations and everybody's informed because you have that data. So important to document all this stuff in all of your cases. And the casework brings that all together in context of an individual case for a client, right? So you're able to see all those things, keep track of your notes and documents along with your structured work, keep track of your billable and non-billable time, your expenses, right? Are you traveling to do this work for this client? And is that reimbursable from the client?
Yep.
You want to keep track of that stuff. And you can also keep track of whether it's reimbursable or not, right?
Yeah.
And then being able to invoice the client based on all of that work. All of that is together in this one application so that in the same context of a given case for a client, you have all of those things together. You can create the invoices, send them off to the client, mark when they've been paid, keep track of all that stuff along the way. And then of course we have helpful insights for you too, right? To show you this is how that went, right? How did the case go or how is it currently going? So you get a snapshot of, we've got X amount of work still to do. We've spent X amount on, billable time has been accrued, how much non-billable time, et cetera. And then you can also see that across all of your work, right? You can see it for individual clients. You can see it for your entire account across the time span and be able to have real-time information about how your teams are doing, how the work is going with your different clients, right? It really makes it so that you can do the best work for your client, give them the best information about that work along the way, and that just makes everything go smooth.
Yeah. If this case feels familiar, it's probably because it is. Most teams don't realize they have this problem until they map the work properly.
And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The good news is it's fixable, but only if you structure your execution the right way.
If you're dealing with this inside your own programs, this is exactly why we built the casework. It gives you a way to actually see what's happening across the work.
Make sure that you subscribe to Working the Case newsletter on LinkedIn so that you get weekly breakdowns like this.
And you can also visit thecasework.com if you want to understand how to bring this level of visibility into your own organization.
This is not rare. It's predictable. And with the right structure, it's also solvable. Thanks for joining us with this case, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. All right, that's the case for this week.
In our next episode, we'll keep working the same engagement and break down the next layer of where execution started to slip and what should have been caught earlier.
If you're seeing versions of this work in your own work, you're not alone. Make sure you're subscribed to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast so you don't miss what comes next.
And if you want the full written breakdown, you can find our Working the Case newsletter on LinkedIn, where we introduce and go deeper into each of these engagements.
So make sure you're subscribed there as well.
See you later.